Why did the desert feel more alive than the enemy? That was the thought that struck Sarah as the sand erupted around her like a living thing, spitting fire and fury. Every grain that hit her cheek felt like it carried intent, a reminder that even the land itself wanted her gone. Machine gun chatter cracked overhead, chewing through the dunes, hurling grit into the sky until it rained back down on helmets and rifles. The Marines had barely set foot on the shore, and already the earth was rejecting them, spitting them out with heat and bullets. Sarah pressed herself flat, chest heaving, the sting of burning sand creeping through her vest until her skin flinched as if branded. She touched her helmet instinctively, only to hiss at the searing heat. The steel meant to protect her was fast becoming another enemy. A cry pulled her attention left. One of her Marines stumbled, boot kicked sideways by a burst of fire that struck too close. He collapsed, rifle tumbling from his hands, weapon already half clogged with sand. Without thinking, Sarah lunged. She grabbed his vest straps and dragged him across the ground until they slid behind the half-formed cover of a dune. His eyes were wide, unfocused. His lips moved like he wanted to speak but could only manage a cough. "Stay low," she rasped, voice raw from the dry wind. "Stay with me." Her throat burned, every command scraped like glass, yet her tone had to hold. Weakness was contagious. If they saw her falter, they would unravel. Her fingers brushed grit from the magazine well of her rifle, but it was hopeless. The sand seeped into everything, their gear, their lungs, even the cracks of their skin. The rifles that were supposed to save them felt brittle now, as if one wrong pull would shatter them. Around her, men and women crawled forward, movements labored, each one heavier than it should have been. Their helmets baked, their lips split open from thirst. Sweat rolled into their eyes, blinding them as surely as the glare. Sarah risked a glance toward the horizon. But there was no horizon anymore, only a wavering mirage, dunes bending and twisting like ghosts, masking the muzzle flashes that cracked and spat from hidden nests. Every shimmer could be a bunker. Every blur might be an enemy. She clenched her jaw, refusing to let the doubt creep in. The desert wanted her uncertain. Hesitation was death. Her hand brushed against her flask. She unscrewed it and took a single swallow. The water inside was already hot, tasting like soup more than relief, but even that burn felt worth something. She passed it to the Marine beside her. He grimaced as though it scorched his tongue, but he drank. Thirst left no choice. The desert offered no mercy. A round struck so close that sand blasted her face, grinding grit into her eyes until they burned and watered. She wiped with a dirty glove, smearing mud into the sting. Still, her voice didn't waver. "Forward crawl, stay tight." The squad obeyed, their movements clumsy but desperate. Sarah watched each of them as they dragged themselves across the sand, bodies bent, breaths ragged, wills already cracking under the weight of sun and fire. She had told herself leadership was a burden she was ready for. But in that moment, staring at their faces, at the trust, the expectation, she felt the weight pressing harder than the sun overhead. Another Marine tried to rise too quickly, panic in his glassy eyes. He was ready to sprint, ready to bolt into open ground, ready to die without realizing it. Sarah reached out and yanked him down, her grip sharp, her voice sharper. "You move when I move." He froze, chest heaving, and she saw the shame in his face, but better shame than a body for the desert to swallow. The trench line ahead was invisible, buried behind mirage and dune, hidden in the shimmer. But Sarah knew it was there, spitting death from behind its curtain. She pressed her elbows into the sand and dragged herself forward, rifle clutched against her chest. The grit scraped her teeth with every breath. The air tasted of metal, dust, and blood. Her squad mirrored her crawl, shadows dragging themselves like wounded animals. It was the only movement that kept them alive. Her helmet slipped down over her brow, cutting into tender skin already rubbed raw. She adjusted it with a hiss. Protection and torment, shield and brand. Every piece of their gear had become that contradiction, necessary, yet unbearable. The world had shrunk to sound, heat, grit, and fear. Machine guns crackled, the ocean roared faintly behind, and the wind howled across dunes that erased all footprints within seconds. Even their presence was temporary. The desert would pretend they had never come. She shouted orders, voice trembling but steady enough to carry. And all the while something gnawed at her. It wasn't just the bullets, it wasn't just the heat. It was the silence in her radio, the static hissing like a ghost in her ear. Command's voice should have been there, guiding them, promising reinforcements. But all she heard was interference, fragments drowned beneath the storm of dust. They were cut off, alone. Every step forward or backward belonged to her. Her gut twisted with doubt she refused to voice. What if she was leading them wrong? What if forward meant slaughter and back meant erasure? She looked at the faces of her Marines, pale beneath grime, eyes cracked with desperation. They looked at her and saw certainty, but inside she felt only weight. She forced another swallow from her canteen, hated herself for wanting more. They crawled forward a dozen feet. The desert shoved them back 10. Progress vanished like footprints in the wind. Another Marine collapsed beside her, retching into the sand. Heat stroke clawed through his body, turning him weak as a child. Sarah barked at another to drag him, though she saw that Marine's own hands tremble under the effort. Too early, too soon for bodies to be breaking. Yet the desert was faster than battle ever could be. She blinked against sweat, against grit, against despair, and dragged her own arms forward 1 inch at a time. The bunkers were out there, hidden, waiting. She had to believe that. But the silence on the radio whispered otherwise. Why did the air feel heavier than steel? Sarah tasted dust with every breath, her tongue swollen, sticking to the roof of her mouth. The sun pressed down with the weight of a hammer, each ray another strike against her already fraying body. Around her, the Marines crawled and faltered, heads low, faces streaked with salt lines from sweat that had dried too quickly. The shoreline that had felt like hell minutes ago now seemed merciful compared to this endless stretch of dunes. At least the ocean had offered air that moved, water that mocked. Out here, even the wind came as an enemy, sweeping away their footprints, erasing proof that they had fought for every inch. She looked back once only to see emptiness. No trail, no sign. The desert had already decided they were nothing. A Marine groaned beside her. His helmet tilted, his face pale and clammy. He clawed at his vest, fumbling for his canteen, but when he tipped it back, nothing came. He shook it hard, as if shaking could force a drop to appear. The hollow rattle was louder than the gunfire to Sarah's ears. Without a word, she unscrewed her own canteen and pressed it into his hand. He looked at her, shame flickering across his cracked lips, but he drank. 1 swallow, maybe 2. She wanted to snatch it back, to guard what little she had, but her hand didn't move. When he passed it back, lighter than before, she sealed it without hesitation. Leadership wasn't just bullets and commands. It was sacrifice, but sacrifice burned as hot as the sun. A burst of fire cracked overhead, chewing into the sand near her boots. She shoved herself flat, arms trembling as she pressed her face into grit. The taste filled her mouth again, bitter and choking. The squad froze, hearts pounding loud enough to feel in the sand beneath them. The trench line was out there, she knew it. She could hear the rhythm of guns, the cruel cadence of trained defenders cutting arcs into open ground. Each burst was too precise to be random. They weren't just spraying. They were toying, forcing the Marines to stay pinned, watching as thirst and heat did the rest. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. The sound of fire, the moans of her men, the rattle of gear, it all folded into one thought. They are waiting for us to break. She opened her eyes again. "We move," she whispered hoarsely. A Marine shook his head, lips trembling. His skin was blistered from sun, his eyes red from grit. "We'll be cut down." Sarah's hand touched his shoulder firm. "If we don't move, we'll die here anyway. The desert doesn't care how we go." It wasn't courage in her voice. It was the absence of choice. She pointed forward. Her eyes tracked the rhythm of fire, the seconds when barrels swung away, when the mirage shimmered just enough to offer a crack in the pattern. It wasn't safety. It was chance. Crawl, she ordered, when the gun shifts, no sooner. They obeyed slowly, hesitant. Sarah pressed her elbows deep into the sand and dragged herself forward again, rifle cradled close, her chest scraping grit with each inch. The burn of raw skin didn't matter. The heat pressing into her skull didn't matter. Only the rhythm. She listened for it, counted the beats between bursts, felt her pulse match it until she knew when the next pause would come. Her squad mirrored her, their movements clumsy but desperate. Sand filled their mouths, their nostrils, their ears. The desert wasn't just outside them. It was inside now, a living thing invading every crack it could find. Sarah glanced sideways and saw a Marine falter, his head dropping against the ground. His body shook. Heat stroke was taking him. She grabbed his vest and pulled, dragging him along as she crawled. Her muscles screamed, but she didn't let go. The desert wanted bodies. It wouldn't get his, not yet. When the guns shifted, she moved again. A burst of fire chewed the ground behind her, too close, hot grains stinging her neck. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Fear was a shadow waiting for acknowledgement. She would not give it space. A scream split the air, short, sharp. A Marine to her left jerked, a round tearing through his arm. Blood spattered across the sand, crimson vanishing into beige as though the desert drank it instantly. "Keep moving," Sarah barked, voice breaking but unyielding. She crawled faster, dragging herself with strength she didn't believe she had. The wounded Marine stumbled, clutching his arm. Another dropped beside him, hauling him forward, teeth clenched against the weight. Sarah felt pride sting her chest even through the fear. They were still holding each other up. That meant something. The ground dipped slightly ahead, a shallow shadow beneath the glare. Sarah slid into it, pressing flat as another burst swept overhead. The cover wasn't much, but it was something. She lifted her head, scanning through the blur of heat. There a machine gun nest, half hidden by dunes, half concealed by the mirage, but she saw it. The barrel jerked side to side, spitting in arcs, predictable arcs. A crack in the wall. She signaled with her hand, 3 fingers cutting through the haze. 3 Marines to follow. They nodded weakly, their helmets gleaming under the hammering sun. Their goggles were so coated in grit they might as well have been blind. Still, they moved. The crawl toward the nest was agony. Sarah's elbows were raw, her side aching with each drag. Her rifle dug into her chest, heavy, clogged, unreliable. She wanted to throw it away but clutched it instead. Even broken, it was still hers. The rhythm of the gun filled her ears. Steady, merciless, but between its bursts she heard something else. The ragged breaths of her squad, the quiet groans of bodies pushed past breaking. It was music, too, the sound of persistence. They closed the distance yard by yard, invisible under the dune's shadow. Sarah's pulse hammered in her temples. Sweat poured into her eyes, stinging until everything blurred. But the nest loomed larger now, the sandbags taking shape through the shimmer. She reached for her grenade. Fingers slick with sweat slipped once before gripping hard. The metal was hot, heavy, a promise of release. "Ready," she mouthed. The Marines beside her nodded. She pulled the pin. For a heartbeat she almost prayed. Not to win, not even to live, just to break the cycle of crawling, of thirst, of being erased inch by inch. The grenade arced into the mirage. The explosion was a dull roar that shook the air, drowning out the sun for one blessed second. Smoke and sand erupted, blotting the nest from view. Sarah didn't think, she moved. Rifle in hand, bayonet fixed, body screaming but legs pumping, she surged forward with a raw shout that shredded her throat. The Marines followed, their voices breaking, desperate, furious, alive. They hit the nest like a wave. The defenders inside barely had time to recover. Sarah's rifle fired once before jamming, the bolt grinding to a halt. She rammed forward with the bayonet instead, striking a shadow that collapsed beneath her. Beside her, a Marine tackled another enemy, fists and steel slamming into bone. The fight was primal, stripped of distance and strategy, reduced to noise and survival. The air stank of cordite, sweat, and blood. When silence came, it wasn't complete. It rang in their ears, jagged, broken by groans. The nest was theirs, but the price was carved into the sand. One Marine lay still, his helmet split, blood soaking beneath him. Another gasped weakly, a wound spreading crimson across his side. Sarah's chest tightened as she counted faces, forcing her voice steady even as her throat closed. She crouched beside the wounded, pressing cloth against the bleeding, whispering words she didn't believe. "Hold on, stay with us, just hold on." Her eyes lifted to the horizon. More shimmer, more lies, more fire waiting behind dunes. Victory here was only a moment. She looked at her Marines, pale, trembling, broken, and forced her voice out again. "We move, we don't stop." Because if they did, the desert would finish what the guns had started. Why did the world vanish all at once? One moment Sarah was staring at the horizon, watching mirages dance like cruel illusions. The next, the sky itself collapsed into a wall of dust. The storm struck with a roar that drowned out everything, the gunfire, the shouting, even the pounding of her own heart. Sand whipped through the air in choking sheets, blotting out sun and sight until the battlefield shrank to nothing but a brown blur. She dropped low, scarf yanked over her mouth, goggles pressed hard to her face. It didn't matter. The grit slashed through cloth and glass as if nothing could stop it. Every breath scraped like shards of glass dragging down her throat. Around her, shapes moved, her Marines or enemies she couldn't tell. She shouted names, voice raw, but the storm devoured her words. They vanished instantly, lost in the endless howl. A Marine stumbled into her, clutching his shoulder. Blood mingled with dust, the wound turning dark as the sand drank it greedily. She pressed her palm against it, fingers trembling as she tried to staunch the flow. But even as she worked, she felt the futility. The desert wanted to swallow the blood just as it wanted to swallow them. Another shape dropped to its knees nearby. His lips moved without sound, eyes empty. Sarah grabbed his vest, dragging him forward across ground that shifted beneath her. Dunes melted and reshaped themselves every second. There was no direction anymore. North, south, forward, back, all erased. Her goggles fogged, scratched until the world was nothing but a smear. She yanked them away for clarity, only to be punished instantly. The storm clawed at her eyes, tearing tears until they streamed down her face. Still she crawled, still she pulled. The desert didn't want them to fight. It wanted them gone. Gunfire cut through the storm, random, erratic, fired blind. Bullets still found flesh. A Marine screamed, clutching his thigh. Another fell flat, convulsing with heat stroke. Sarah's chest tightened with dread as she dragged herself to him, slapping his cheek, shouting words she couldn't even hear over the howl. "Don't you give in. Don't you let it take you." The storm was more than wind and grit. It was a voice. A voice whispering surrender, whispering collapse, whispering that to stop crawling was to find peace. Her body believed it, her muscles begged for it, her lungs ached for it. Every part of her screamed, "Lie down, be done." But she looked at the faces around her, hollowed by thirst, cracked with despair, and knew she didn't have that choice. If she surrendered, they all would. Leadership wasn't rank. It wasn't medals. It was this crawling forward when your body already belonged to the sand. Her rifle was dead weight in her hands. She worked the bolt furiously, but it jammed, filled with grit. She slammed the butt against the ground, forcing it open, only for it to clog again the next moment. Steel betrayed her just as flesh did. Weapons, radios, even her own body, everything was breaking. She gritted her teeth and dragged the useless rifle anyway, not because it could fire, but because abandoning it felt like abandoning herself. A Marine screamed suddenly, his voice piercing through the storm. He fired wildly into the haze, rounds cutting blind arcs. His eyes were wide, terror stripping reason away. He wasn't seeing enemies. He was seeing shadows the storm itself made into monsters. Sarah lunged. She grabbed the rifle, wrenching it down, her voice hoarse as she shouted at him, forcing him back to the ground. She met his eyes. Terror lived there, raw and childlike. The desert had broken him. She didn't blame him. She feared she was next. The storm raged for what felt like forever. Seconds blurred into minutes, minutes into hours. Every gust reshaped the battlefield until Sarah no longer believed in distance, in progress, in time itself. She crawled beside another Marine who had collapsed face first in the sand. His skin was scalding to the touch, his body convulsing in the grip of heat stroke. She pulled him onto his back, slapped his cheek, poured the last drops from her canteen into his mouth. He coughed, choked, but swallowed. Her own throat cried out for that water, but she let the canteen hang empty. She dragged him until her arms shook, then dragged him further. Her legs cramped, her ribs ached, her eyes streamed with salt. Her helmet felt like a furnace pressing down, searing her scalp. She wanted to rip it off, hurl it into the storm, but she forced herself to keep it on. Protection and torment like everything else. Keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. The mantra beat in her skull, steadier than the storm, steadier than the guns. It was all she had left. And then finally thinness. The storm began to fade. The roar softened to a howl, then a hiss. Visibility stretched, a few feet at first, then yards. The sun returned with merciless triumph, blazing down as if mocking their survival. Sarah raised her head, her lips cracked and bleeding. All she saw was more dunes, more mirage, more emptiness. Her heart sank. The storm hadn't carried them closer. It hadn't spared them. It had only stripped them of strength, of water, of hope. She pressed her hand to her side and felt warmth spreading, blood. A wound she hadn't even noticed in the chaos. She could have stopped. She should have. But the thought of stopping sent a chill through her more terrifying than the wound itself. She looked at her squad. Ghosts, hollow faces, trembling bodies, lips split and bleeding. They shuffled forward in silence, every step heavier than the last. One Marine staggered to his feet, dragging another by the arm. His legs trembled with every motion, but he refused to let go. Sarah saw it and felt a flicker of pride. Courage wasn't a charge or a roar. Courage was this, pulling someone one more step when you barely had the strength to move yourself. She clung to that spark, nurtured it in her chest like an ember in a storm. The rifles cut into their shoulders, bruising flesh raw from sweat and sand. Armor plates pressed like stones against ribs. Their boots sank, each step erased behind them. Progress was invisible, but still they moved. Water was more valuable than bullets now. Canteens were passed hand to hand, tilted like relics, each drop rationed like gold. No one asked for more than their share. Not even when lips bled, not even when tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths. Sarah took her last swallow, warm and nauseating, then sealed the empty canteen and accepted that thirst was her new companion. Enemy fire returned in bursts, sharp, sudden, punishing. A Marine stumbled with a graze across his arm. Blood streaked red down to stain the sand. Sarah pressed cloth against it, urging him forward. She refused to let blood mean the end. The radio was dead, casing cracked, wires spilling like veins torn open. She strapped it to her pack anyway. It was useless, but it meant something. It meant connection. Even in silence, it meant she was still defying the desert's attempt to erase them. Her wound throbbed harder now, each heartbeat another stab in her ribs. She pressed her palm against it, feeling warmth spread across her glove, and forced herself to rise. Pain is a liar, don't listen. Her legs trembled, her chest burned. Her mind whispered surrender, but her voice when it came was steady. Forward. The squad obeyed. not because they had strength, but because she had not stopped. One crawl, one drag, one step at a time. She told herself not to look at the distance, not to look at the mirages, not to wonder how far the bunkers were. Distance was a lie. Only movement was truth. The desert screamed at them to quit. The sun pressed like fire. The storm's ghost lingered in their lungs. Their rifles jammed, their bodies staggered, their water was gone. Yet still they moved. And Sarah knew then, with clarity carved in blood and sand, survival wasn't glory. It wasn't victory. It was persistence. And persistence was the only weapon the desert couldn't take from them. Why did the bunkers look like ghosts? Sarah narrowed her eyes through the shimmer, trying to decide if the dark shapes ahead were real or another cruel mirage. Every dune before had lied to her, twisted by heat, until it promised salvation that vanished at the next step. But this time the shadows didn't sway with the mirage. They sat heavy, carved into the dunes, unmoving, bunkers real. The sight should have filled her with relief. Instead, it filled her with dread. Her side throbbed with each breath. Blood soaked into her fatigues, sticky and hot, spreading like another enemy determined to take her down. She pressed her palm hard against it, forced her teeth together, and told herself the same lie she had been whispering since the storm. Pain is a liar, ignore it. If she admitted the wound, if she showed weakness, it would spread through the squad like fire through dry brush. They were ghosts already, faces hollowed by thirst, bodies bent under heat, lips cracked open, eyes dull with exhaustion. The only thing keeping them upright was her voice. And her voice had to sound unbreakable, even when her chest felt hollow and her ribs screamed. One Marine stumbled, collapsing to his knees. Another bent, pulling him up by the vest, guiding him forward even as his own legs shook. Sarah saw it and forced pride into her chest, feeding it like a spark. They were broken but not done. Not yet. She raised her arm and gestured forward. No grand words, no promises. Just a hand pointing at the shadowed shapes of bunkers in the dunes. Move. The squad obeyed, not because they had strength, but because she hadn't given them permission to stop. Their boots sank deep into the loose sand. Each step was erased behind them by wind, mocking their effort. It didn't matter. Footprints didn't win wars. Persistence did. Water had vanished hours ago. Canteens hung light on their belts, passed like relics between cracked hands, each one tilted, shaken, found empty. No one asked for more than their share, not even when thirst had split tongues open. A Marine rasped, almost there. His voice was more hope than truth. Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in distance, in an end, in something other than endless dunes. But belief was dangerous. She had learned that lesson already. Eyes up, she whispered. Stay low, keep moving. Her own knees threatened to buckle. The world swam with black edges. She bit her lip until blood filled her mouth, sharp and metallic, anchoring her to the moment. If she collapsed, they all would. Enemy fire crackled suddenly from ahead, snapping them back to life. Bullets chewed sand in sharp bursts, cutting arcs across the ground. The bunkers weren't illusions. They were waiting. A Marine cried out as a round grazed his shoulder. Blood streaked his arm, soaking his sleeve. Sarah dropped beside him, pressing cloth against the wound. He gritted his teeth but kept crawling when she pushed him forward. That was the truth of battle here. Not triumph, not charges, not victory, just movement. Wounded and bleeding, they moved anyway. The rifles on their shoulders betrayed them again. Bolts clogged, barrels stiff, triggers refusing to move. Sarah worked hers furiously, forcing the mechanism to cycle. Each shot was uncertain. Each weapon was as fragile as the bodies carrying it. Still they held on. The bunkers loomed closer, dark shapes half swallowed by dunes. Sarah could feel their weight pressing against her chest, the knowledge that this was it, the final wall. Either they broke through, or they would be erased by sun, sand, and fire. She pressed her hand harder against her wound, the ache spreading with every breath. Her vision blurred, but she refused to stop. She looked at her squad, ghosts yes, but ghosts still moving, and raised her hand. "Prepare to breach." Her voice cracked, raw, but the words landed. Helmets tilted, bayonets fixed, eyes narrowed, hollow yet determined. Sarah reached for a grenade, fingers trembling as they curled around the pin. The metal slipped once, nearly fell, but she gripped, forcing her hand steady. "On my mark," she whispered. Smoke would be their shield, bayonets their only truth. The desert had tried to erase them, the storm had tried to scatter them, the sun had tried to burn them out, but they were still here, and being here was enough. She hurled the grenade. It arced high, disappeared into the shimmer, and burst with a muffled roar. Smoke spilled, thick and choking, cloaking the dunes in shifting shadow. "Now!" The Marines surged forward, not fast, not strong, but with everything they had left. Sarah ran with them, legs heavy as stone, blood soaking her side, rifle clutched like an anchor. The sand blurred beneath her. Bullets snapped past. Voices broke in ragged shouts. The bunkers swallowed them. Inside was chaos. Shadows moved in smoke, bayonets clashed against rifles, fists slammed into bodies. Sarah's rifle jammed instantly. She rammed forward with the bayonet, striking a figure that collapsed beneath her weight. Another lunged. She slammed the butt of her weapon into his helmet, feeling the jolt shiver up her arms. The air reeked of sweat, blood, and hot metal. Shouts echoed off walls. The floor slicked with sand and crimson. Every movement was instinct. Every strike was desperation. Her wound screamed, each thrust tearing her ribs apart. But she forced herself onward, shouting orders between gasps. The Marines fought like fragments of themselves, each one clinging to instinct, to the simple truth that stopping meant death. A final shot cracked, then silence. The bunker was theirs. Sarah leaned against the wall, lungs burning, ears ringing, body trembling so hard she thought she might collapse. Her rifle hung useless in her hands, bayonet dripping with sand and blood. Around her the Marines slumped against walls, collapsed in corners, some groaning, some silent. Helmets were torn free, thrown aside, too hot to bear another second. Canteens were lifted, shaken, found empty. The air inside was suffocating, thick with dust and iron, but it was shelter, shade, a pause. Sarah lowered herself to the ground, her wound bleeding freely now. She pressed her palm against it, hissed through clenched teeth, and stared at the Marines. They were alive. Not all, but enough. Her throat tightened. Relief and grief tangled until she couldn't tell which was stronger. The desert had tried to erase them. The enemy had tried to pin them, but persistence had carried them through. Not victory, not triumph, just persistence. She leaned her head back against the wall, eyes fluttering shut, and let the silence settle. The wind whispered outside, sweeping away footprints as it always did. Inside, broken Marines shared glances, sips of dirty water, and breaths of air that felt heavier than gold. And Sarah understood, survival wasn't glory. It was defiance. And defiance was enough. Why did silence feel heavier than the fight? The gunfire had stopped. The shouting, the chaos, the ringing clash of steel against steel, all gone. Yet the silence that filled the bunker pressed against Sarah's chest harder than any explosion. She sat slumped against a cracked wall, palm pressed against her side where blood seeped steadily through her fatigues. Her glove was sticky, hot, and she didn't dare pull it away. If she saw the wound, if she admitted its depth, she might finally collapse. Around her, the Marines were shadows of themselves. Some sprawled on the ground, helmets tossed aside, eyes closed in exhausted relief. Others pressed cloth against wounds, muttering curses that barely rose above whispers. A few sat with their backs against sandbags, heads bowed, rifles hanging useless in their hands. The bunker reeked of sweat, cordite, and blood. The air was thick, hard to breathe, yet it was shelter, shade, the first they'd had since the shoreline. Sarah pulled herself upright with a hiss. Her body screamed to stay down, to sink into the dirt and never rise again. But her eyes caught the wounded Marine near the sandbags, chest rising too shallow, lips blue at the edges, and she knew she couldn't. She crawled to him, knees dragging, palms still pressed against her own side. His eyes fluttered open when she leaned over him. Fear lived there, quiet but sharp. "You're all right," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't true. She pressed fabric against his side, trying to slow the blood. Her fingers trembled, slick with his life spilling into the sand. He tried to speak. Only a rasp came. She leaned closer. His cracked lips formed a word she almost didn't hear. "Water." Her throat tightened. She reached for her canteen out of reflex, knowing it was empty. The hollow weight mocked her fingers as she shook it. She hated herself for the lie she was about to tell. "Soon," she whispered. "We'll find more soon." His eyes drifted shut again, as if the promise was enough. Sarah swallowed hard, the burn in her throat worse than any bullet wound. Behind her, a Marine coughed violently, spitting grit and blood. Another groaned, head tilted back against the wall, eyes half-lidded. They weren't resting. They were teetering. The bunker had given them shade, but shade wasn't salvation. It only meant the desert had to wait a little longer before it claimed them. Sarah forced herself to stand. Her knees shook. The world swam with black edges. She pressed her hand against her side and steadied herself with the wall. Leadership wasn't allowed to bleed, not where anyone could see. She turned toward the Marines, faces pale, eyes cracked with exhaustion, each one waiting for her voice. "We hold here," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Patch what you can, rest what you can. We move when the sun dips." No one argued. They didn't have the strength, but she saw doubt flicker across their faces. Rest felt like surrender. Movement felt like suicide. The truth was simple. Both might be right. Sarah sank back against the wall, forcing her breathing to slow, forcing her voice not to waver. She had to sound certain, always certain, even when certainty was gone. The silence stretched. It wasn't peace. It was waiting. One Marine sat across from her, helmet in his lap, staring at it like it was a relic. His scalp was red and blistered, hair matted with sweat. He whispered something to himself, words Sarah couldn't catch. A prayer, maybe, or a curse. Another Marine fumbled with his rifle, wiping grit from the bolt with strips of cloth. Futile work. The storm had filled everything with sand, but the act of cleaning gave him purpose, something to do with trembling hands. Sarah watched them, one by one, clinging to scraps of ritual, scraps of sanity, and she realized something she hadn't let herself admit before. They weren't waiting for orders. They were waiting for her to endure. If she stood, they would stand. If she fell, they would fall. The thought cut deeper than her wound. Her head tilted back against the wall. For the first time since the landing, her mind wandered. She saw the ocean again, waves rising behind them, mocking their thirst. She saw the shoreline erupt with fire, sand leaping into the air like the earth itself was against them. She saw herself dragging Marines across grit, tackling panicked men before bullets found them, whispering lies about water and hope. And she wondered, quietly, if leadership wasn't courage at all. If leadership was just learning how to lie convincingly enough that people believed survival was still possible. Her eyelids drooped. She fought to keep them open, to stay alert. But exhaustion pressed heavier than the desert, heavier than the fight. A hand shook her shoulder. She jolted awake, pain flaring in her side. A Marine crouched over her, eyes wide. "Movement," he rasped. Sarah blinked hard, forcing her vision to focus. Out beyond the bunker's cracks, shadows shifted in the dunes. Figures, maybe enemy, maybe mirage. Her heart pounded. "Positions," she whispered, voice snapping them back to life. Marines lifted rifles with trembling hands, bolts grinding, weapons clumsy but raised. The shadows paused, then slipped away, swallowed by the glare. Silence again. Her pulse slowed, but only slightly. The desert wasn't done. The enemy wasn't done. Neither would give them mercy. She pressed her palm against her wound, teeth clenched. Every breath was a reminder that she was breaking, but she couldn't. Not yet. Her eyes swept over her squad again, every face waiting, every body trembling, every soul clinging to the one thread she refused to drop. Persistence. That was all they had. And persistence had to be enough. Why did survival feel quieter than death? The bunker had gone still, too still. No more gunfire, no more shouts, only ragged breathing, groans, and the sound of sand hissing through the cracks in the walls. Sarah sat hunched against a corner, her hand clamped over her side. Blood seeped slowly between her fingers, sticky and warm. She felt it pulse with every heartbeat, and she hated the reminder that her body was losing a battle she couldn't afford to fight. Her Marines were scattered across the bunker. Some slumped in silence, eyes half closed. Others fiddled with weapons, cleaning bolts that would never truly work again. One lay flat, chest rising shallow, his face the color of ash. They looked less like soldiers and more like survivors of some great collapse, haunted, skeletal, hollow-eyed. The fight was not over. Sarah knew it. They all knew it. Somewhere beyond the dunes, more nests waited. The trench line stretched further. The enemy hadn't thrown everything at them yet. The desert hadn't either. And yet here they were, pinned again, this time by silence instead of bullets. Her throat ached for water. Her lips were split, bleeding in tiny cracks that stung when she tried to swallow. She wanted to ask for a canteen. She wanted to beg. But her eyes drifted to the squad, canteens rattled light, empty, passed from hand to hand like relics of a faith that no longer promised salvation. She stayed quiet. A Marine to her left muttered curses under his breath, voice shaking. Another rocked gently, helmet cradled in his lap. A third hummed something faint, a tune that barely carried through the heavy air. Rituals, habits, small anchors to keep them from floating into despair. Sarah pulled herself upright with a hiss. Pain lanced through her ribs, white-hot, nearly buckling her knees. She forced her voice steady, steady enough to sound like certainty. Check wounds, tighten bandages, clean your rifles. We move when the sun breaks lower. No one groaned, no one argued. They obeyed in silence, hands trembling but moving. That was the secret she'd learned out here. Orders weren't about logic. They were about rhythm. As long as her voice filled the silence, they had a reason not to collapse. She moved through the bunker slowly, pressing her hand against walls when her legs threatened to fold. She crouched by the wounded, adjusted bandages with fingers that shook, whispered lies of reassurance. You'll be fine. Hold on. Not much longer now. She could see in their eyes they didn't believe her, but they wanted to, and that was enough. Her vision swam, her wound pulsed harder. Each step felt heavier. She told herself it was just exhaustion, just the desert pressing down, not blood loss, not weakness. Leadership wasn't allowed weakness. A Marine caught her wrist when she reached to check his bandage. His hand was hot, trembling. His cracked lips formed a question. Are you hit? For a heartbeat she froze. His eyes searched hers, desperate, honest. She forced a smile, shook her head, just tired. He let go, nodding faintly, and leaned back against the wall. Sarah exhaled slowly, pressing her palm harder to her side when his eyes closed again. Lying felt like another wound, but truth would have been worse. The hours stretched, slow and brutal. The heat outside pressed into the bunker, seeping into every breath. Shade wasn't salvation, it was just another kind of suffocation. When the sun began to dip, painting the dunes in long shadows, Sarah felt the shift in the air. This was the moment. They couldn't wait for night. Darkness would scatter them, blind them, turn order into chaos. She forced herself to her feet. We move, she said. Heads lifted, eyes cracked open. Marines groaned as they pushed themselves upright, swaying under the weight of packs and rifles. No one wanted to. Everyone knew they had to. Sarah slung her rifle across her chest. The bolt was stiff, jammed with grit, but she held it like it mattered. She pressed her hand against her side one last time, then curled her fingers into a fist, willing her body to hold. They filed out of the bunker into the open air. The desert met them with silence as if waiting. The dunes stretched endless, glowing faintly in the dying sun. No gunfire yet. No storm, only expectation. Their boots sank with every step. Footprints vanished behind them, swept away as quickly as they were made. Sarah watched the erasure, felt it gnaw at her. Progress was invisible. Existence itself felt temporary. She led them forward anyway. One Marine stumbled. Another caught him. A chain reaction of weakness and resilience. Sarah clung to that sight, the way they still held each other up, even when they had nothing left to give. Her own legs shook. Her vision blurred. She bit her tongue until blood filled her mouth again, sharp anchoring. The bunkers loomed ahead, more of them now darker, heavier. The enemy still waited. She could feel their eyes, their weapons trained on dunes that hadn't yet betrayed them. Her pulse pounded, each beat another knife in her ribs. But she raised her hand, steady, signaling them to spread, to crawl, to move with caution. The Marines obeyed, silent shadows dragging themselves across sand. She wanted to collapse. She wanted to lie down and let the desert take her, but she kept moving. Because if she stopped, they would too. And persistence was the only thing left. Why did the horizon feel closer than her heartbeat? Sarah stared at the dark shapes rising out of the dunes, more bunkers, bigger than before, etched like scars across the desert. They were real, too real, and they were waiting. Her side burned with every step, blood soaking deeper into her fatigues. She pressed her palm hard against it, trying to numb the ache, trying to believe she was more than her wound. Her squad never saw her stumble. She made sure of that, but each yard stole more from her than she had left to give. The Marines followed, their shadows stretching long in the dying sun. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies bent, their rifles unreliable. Yet when she raised her hand, they stopped. When she lowered it, they crawled. Her voice no longer needed to shout. The rhythm of survival had become instinct. Gunfire cracked suddenly from the bunkers, sharp bursts that tore the sand around them. Sarah dropped instantly, her ribs screaming. Marines scattered into shallow depressions, pressing their faces into grit as rounds whined overhead. Her heart hammered. The enemy hadn't broken. They were dug in, waiting to finish the job. Her throat burned as she rasped, "Smoke." A Marine fumbled in his pouch, hands shaking, and produced a canister. Sarah took it, fingers trembling as she yanked the pin. She hurled it forward, the motion sending pain lancing through her ribs until her vision swam. Smoke blossomed, thick and choking, curling across the dunes like a living fog. "Go," she shouted, her voice raw. They surged forward, not fast, not strong, but together. Their boots pounded sand, their lungs screamed, their rifles clutched like anchors. Sarah ran with them, every step agony, blood hot against her skin. The world vanished into smoke. Shadows flickered, friend or enemy she couldn't tell. Bullets tore blindly through the haze, each one a coin toss of survival. She raised her rifle, pulled the trigger. A jam. The bolt refused to slide. She slammed it against the ground, cursed, forced it open. The weapon spat once, then choked again. Her bayonet gleamed in the haze. Primitive, reliable, she gripped it tight. The bunker loomed out of the smoke, sandbags and concrete black against the swirling gray. Marines collided with it, slamming into the line with raw, desperate force. The breach was chaos. Sarah shoved her way inside, bayonet first, colliding with a figure in the haze. She drove the steel forward, felt it bite, felt the body crumple. Another lunged at her. She swung the butt of her rifle, felt it crack against a helmet. Pain jolted through her arms, but she didn't stop. The bunker roared with noise, gunfire deafening in close quarters. shouts blending with screams, fists hammering, blades scraping. The air stank of cordite and iron. It was suffocating, burning, thick with heat and blood. A Marine beside her tackled an enemy to the ground, fists slamming again and again until the body stilled. Another swung a rifle like a club, striking shadows in the smoke. Sarah's ribs screamed with each movement. Her vision swam with black edges, but she forced herself forward, shouting orders she barely believed. Push, keep pushing. Her bayonet slammed into another figure. She pulled it free, chest heaving, lungs burning. Her wound tore wider. Warmth spread down her side. She staggered against a wall, pressed her hand against stone, forced herself upright again. Not yet, not yet, not yet. Every strike, every breath, every heartbeat was persistence alone. The melee blurred into instinct. Hands, steel, screams, the sharp crack of rifles fired point-blank. Sand mixed with blood across the floor, turning it slick beneath their boots. Then sudden silence. It felt jagged, incomplete, broken by groans and the ringing in her ears. The bunker was theirs. Sarah leaned hard against the wall, her lungs searing, her side pouring heat down her leg. She wanted to sink to the ground, let darkness take her, but her eyes caught the Marines instead. They slumped against sandbags, rifles slipping from their hands. Helmets lay discarded, chests heaved. Some coughed, some groaned, some simply stared, blank and hollow. But they were alive. Not all, never all. Bodies lay scattered across the bunker floor, still and silent. Blood darkened the sand, already being drunk by the desert through cracks in the walls. Sarah's throat tightened. She forced herself away from the wall, forced herself to move to the wounded. Her legs trembled, her ribs screamed, her vision blurred. She pressed cloth against wounds, whispered lies of reassurance, clutched trembling hands. You'll make it. Just breathe. Stay with me. Her own body begged for rest. She ignored it. She always ignored it. The Marines watched her, even in their haze. Their eyes found her first, always her. And she realized, in that moment, that leadership was nothing more than persistence made visible. Her body swayed, nearly collapsed. She gritted her teeth, tasted blood, forced herself upright again. Hold this line, she rasped. Her voice broke, but it was enough. The bunker walls vibrated faintly with wind outside. The desert whispered through cracks, carrying grit that stung her eyes. It would erase their footprints again. It would pretend none of this had happened. But the desert couldn't erase the fact they were still here. Broken, bleeding, breathing. Persistence had carried them through the storm. Persistence had carried them through the breach. And persistence, nothing else, was all they had left. Why did silence always arrive like a stranger? The smoke had thinned. The echoes of fighting were gone. No gunfire, no shouts, no clash of steel. Only the shallow breaths of survivors and the whisper of wind pressing through the cracks in the walls. Sarah sat slumped against a sandbag, her rifle across her lap. The bayonet was still fixed, streaked with sand and blood, the blade heavy as though it carried every fight they'd survived. Her hand pressed weakly against her side. Blood had slowed to a steady seep, sticky and hot beneath her fingers. She couldn't feel pain anymore, only a dull throb that beat in rhythm with her slowing pulse. Her Marines were scattered across the bunker. Some sat hunched with their backs to the wall, staring blankly at the dirt. Others cradled wounds, grimacing as they pressed filthy cloth against them. A few slept with helmets in their laps, breaths shallow, bodies twitching with exhaustion. The air was thick, suffocating. It reeked of iron, grit, sweat. Each breath tasted like rust. Yet no one complained. Complaints had dried up hours ago like everything else. Sarah tilted her head back, eyes fluttering shut. For the first time since the landing, her body begged without shame, rest, just for a moment, just stop. But her eyes opened again when she heard it. A cough, a groan, a whisper, the sound of survival. She looked at them, the faces of her Marines. pale, broken, hollow, yet alive, and she felt something rise in her chest, not pride, not triumph, something smaller, quieter. The knowledge that persistence, fragile and stubborn, had carried them through. One Marine tried to lift his canteen. It rattled empty. He shook it once, twice, then let it drop. No one had water left, not one drop, and yet they were still here. Sarah forced her hand to move. She unclipped her own canteen, the one she already knew was hollow, and held it out to him anyway. He took it, raised it, tilted it back. Nothing came, but the motion mattered. He smiled faintly, lips cracked, before handing it back. Ritual, hope, persistence. Her chest tightened. The bunker walls groaned faintly with the wind. The desert outside waited, patient. The dunes would sweep clean their footprints soon enough, erase the path of blood and grit that had led them here. To the world, they would vanish. To the desert, they had never existed. But inside, in this stifling pocket of silence, they had endured. That was enough. A Marine stirred beside her, young, too young. His eyes cracked open, glassy and unfocused. He whispered, "Did we win?" Sarah froze. The word echoed in her skull. Win. What was victory here? Bodies sprawled across sandbags, rifles jammed and useless, water gone, blood soaking into dirt that would forget them. What kind of victory erased itself the moment the wind blew? Her throat tightened. She brushed a hand across his hair, streaked with sweat and grit. "We're alive," she whispered. His eyes fluttered, closed again. That was the truth. That was the only truth left. Alive. She leaned her head back, staring at the ceiling of the bunker. The cracks spilled thin lines of light across the walls, faint and wavering. Dust drifted through like falling ash. Her body ached, her lungs rasped, her vision blurred. She knew her wound had drained too much from her. She might not see another dawn, but she didn't fear it, not anymore. She thought of every step they had taken, the shoreline exploding with fire, the crawl through heat that pressed harder than bullets, the storm that erased direction itself, the moments she had lied about water, about hope, the way they had moved anyway, 1 inch at a time. It wasn't glory, it wasn't triumph, it was persistence. And persistence was survival. Her eyes slid shut. For a moment she let herself drift, listening to the faintest sounds, the rasp of breathing, the scrape of cloth against wounds, the occasional cough. Proof of life. Her mind whispered a thought she hadn't dared before. Maybe that was all leadership ever was. Not saving everyone. Not outsmarting death. Just being the one too stubborn to stop when everything else begged for surrender. The desert outside would erase them. History might never remember this bunker, this fight, these names. But for now, in this moment, they had the silence. Sarah exhaled, slow and steady. Her chest ached. Her blood seeped. But her lips curved faintly, almost invisible. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in the heart of the desert, persistence had spoken louder than any victory ever could.